The day my husband told me I was too ugly to be his wife, I believed him. Not because his words were true, but because I had spent years slowly learning to see myself through his eyes. I stood in our bedroom with a suitcase half-packed, staring at the woman reflected in the mirror, wondering how someone I had loved enough to build my entire life around could look at me and see nothing worth keeping. 2 years later, that same man walked past a magazine stand in the middle of New York, stopped dead in his tracks, and saw my face staring back at him from the cover of Vogue. He didn't recognize me at first. And when he finally did, the look on his face was something I would remember for the rest of my life. But this isn't a story about becoming beautiful enough to make a man regret leaving. It's about something much deeper. It's about what happens when a woman finally stops measuring her worth through the eyes of someone who never knew how to see her. Before we begin, if you believe in kindness, second chances, and the power of rebuilding your life after heartbreak, please take a moment to like this video, share it with someone who may need to hear this story, leave a comment, and subscribe to Kindness Speaks. Your support helps us continue sharing stories that remind people that sometimes the hardest endings become the beginning of something beautiful. For years, I had been the woman who made herself smaller so someone else could feel bigger. My name was Emma, and at 31, I was married to Daniel, a successful young executive who seemed to have everything people admired. He dressed perfectly, drove an expensive car, knew exactly how to charm a room, and had a smile that made strangers trust him within seconds. When we first met, however, he wasn't interested in any of those things. At least, that's what I thought. He told me he loved the way I laughed. He said he admired how I could make an ordinary evening feel special. He once told me that when he came home after a difficult day, seeing me waiting for him made everything feel lighter. I believed those words because I wanted to believe love could be built on something deeper than appearance. I wasn't the kind of woman magazines put on covers. I had soft features, slightly uneven eyebrows, a round face, and a small scar near my chin from a childhood accident. I had never considered myself unattractive, but I had never been the woman who turned heads when she walked into a room either. I was comfortable with that. I believed beauty was only one small part of a person. Daniel slowly taught me otherwise. At first, his comments were so subtle that I convinced myself I was imagining them. He suggested that I change my hairstyle. Then he encouraged me to lose weight. He started buying me clothes that weren't really my style. When we attended parties, he would sometimes introduce me and then quickly redirect the conversation toward his career, almost as if he was embarrassed by the simplicity of my life. I worked as a junior graphic designer, and I loved what I did. My salary wasn't impressive, but I could turn blank pages into stories, advertisements, and visual ideas. I had dreams of becoming an art director someday. Daniel didn't understand why I cared so much about a career that didn't make me rich. Over time, his compliments disappeared completely. Instead, he began comparing me with other women. There was always someone prettier, someone thinner, someone more fashionable, someone with better hair, someone who looked more impressive beside him. Every comparison felt like a tiny crack in the wall that I was desperately trying to keep standing. Then came the photographs. Daniel became obsessed with how we looked together in public. If I looked tired in a picture, he deleted it. If I wore something he didn't like, he asked me to change before we went out. If someone complimented me, he sometimes responded with an uncomfortable smile, as if he couldn't understand what they were seeing. I started avoiding mirrors. I started choosing clothes based on what I thought would make him happy. I stopped taking pictures. And eventually, without realizing it, I stopped recognizing myself. The night everything ended began like any other ordinary evening. Daniel came home late. He placed his keys on the counter, removed his jacket, and sat across from me without saying a word. There was something frightening in his silence. Then he pushed a folder across the table. Inside were divorce papers. I remember staring at them for several seconds without understanding what I was looking at. He told me he didn't feel the same way anymore. He said he had changed. He said he wanted a different kind of life. And then he said the sentence that shattered something inside me. He told me he was tired of being married to someone who wasn't beautiful enough for the life he wanted. I didn't cry immediately. I simply stared at him. There are moments when pain becomes so enormous that your body doesn't know how to respond. I asked him whether the years we had shared meant nothing. He said they had meant something once. That word stayed with me. Once. As if our marriage had an expiration date determined by the mirror. I packed my things that night. I left with 2 suitcases, a laptop, a box of photographs, and the terrible belief that maybe he had been right. For the first few months, I barely functioned. I moved into a tiny apartment with peeling paint and a window overlooking the side of another building. The heating barely worked. My kitchen consisted of 2 cabinets and a small refrigerator that made strange noises throughout the night. But strangely, that little apartment became the first place in years where I could breathe. No one criticized my face. No one told me what to wear. No one examined photographs before allowing me to keep them. Still, healing didn't happen overnight. There were mornings when I looked into the mirror and heard Daniel's voice in my head. I saw every flaw he had pointed out. I noticed every feature I had once wished were different. Then one afternoon, something unexpected happened. My company needed help preparing a campaign for a local fashion photographer. The regular designer became unavailable, so my supervisor asked me to assist. The photographer was a woman named Claire, nearly 50, with silver-streaked hair and an extraordinary ability to make people feel comfortable in front of a camera. During a break, Claire looked at one of the designs I had created and told me that I had an unusual eye for emotion. I laughed awkwardly and thanked her. Then she asked why I never worked in fashion. I told her I wasn't beautiful enough. The words came out before I could stop them. Claire looked at me for a long moment. Then she said something that changed my life. She told me that beauty wasn't the absence of flaws. Beauty was presence, character, expression, the ability to make someone feel something. She asked me why I had allowed one man's opinion to become my definition. I had no answer. That night, I went home and stood in front of the mirror for nearly an hour. For the first time in 2 years, I didn't ask whether I was beautiful. I asked myself whether I was alive. And I realized I was. That was enough to begin. I started taking care of myself, not to impress anyone, but because I had spent so long neglecting the woman who had survived everything. I returned to drawing. I began photographing ordinary women in ordinary places. Women with wrinkles. Women with scars. Women who had gained weight after pregnancy. Women who had lost hair. Women who didn't think they belonged in magazines. I photographed them exactly as they were. And something extraordinary happened. People responded. My photographs weren't polished in the traditional sense. They were emotional. They showed people laughing, crying, working, struggling, aging, dreaming. Claire began introducing my work to people in the fashion industry. At first, the opportunities were tiny. A local campaign. A small editorial. A freelance project. Then another. Then another. My career changed slowly, almost invisibly. 1 year after my divorce, I was no longer the woman who had been abandoned. I was an artist. I traveled for work. I met people from different backgrounds. I learned how to direct photo shoots. I learned lighting, styling, storytelling, and production. But the most important thing I learned was how to look at people without judging them. Then, 18 months after the divorce, I received an email from an international fashion publication. They wanted to discuss a project. I assumed it was a mistake. It wasn't. They had seen my photography series featuring women who had been told they weren't beautiful enough. The series was called Scene. The project eventually became larger than I ever imagined. The magazine wanted me not only to photograph the campaign but also to appear in it. I nearly declined. The idea of being photographed terrified me. I still carried the scars of Daniel's words. But Claire convinced me to say yes. The photo shoot took place in a studio in New York. There was no attempt to make me look like someone else. They didn't erase my scar. They didn't completely change my face. They didn't turn me into an imaginary version of perfection. They photographed me as I was. When the final image appeared on the screen, I started crying. Not because I suddenly looked beautiful, but because I finally recognized myself. The woman staring back at me looked strong. She looked tired. She looked human. She looked free. A few weeks later, I was told that the image would appear on the cover of Vogue. I sat alone in my apartment when I received the news. I read the email 3 times. Then I laughed. Then I cried. And finally, I whispered to the woman in the mirror that she had made it. Not because Daniel had been wrong about my appearance, but because his opinion no longer mattered. The cover was released on a Monday morning. By noon, the image was everywhere. Social media exploded. People shared the story behind the photograph. They talked about confidence, self-worth, and how society teaches women to measure themselves against impossible standards. And somewhere across the country, Daniel saw it. He was walking through a hotel lobby when he passed a magazine display. He stopped. He looked at the cover. Then he stepped closer. For several seconds he simply stared. The woman on the cover had the same eyes. The same small scar near her chin. The same slightly uneven eyebrows. The same face he had once called inadequate. But there was something different. She wasn't looking at the camera like someone asking for approval. She was looking at it like someone who no longer needed permission to exist. Daniel bought the magazine. He sat alone in the hotel lounge and read the article. The article described my divorce. Not by name. Not with revenge. It simply explained that I had once believed I wasn't beautiful enough and had eventually learned that beauty was never the problem. Daniel called me that evening. I recognized his number immediately. For a moment, I considered ignoring it. Instead, I answered. He apologized. Not dramatically. Not with excuses. He admitted that he had been cruel. He admitted that he had confused appearance with worth. He admitted that losing me had forced him to confront parts of himself he had spent years avoiding. He told me he regretted what he had done. And for the first time, I realized something important. Forgiveness doesn't always mean reopening a door. Sometimes forgiveness means closing it without anger. I told him that I hoped he became a better person. But I also told him that the woman he had divorced no longer existed. She had changed. She had learned. She had healed. And she had finally understood that love should never require someone to become smaller. After the call ended, I sat beside the window. The city lights reflected against the glass. 2 years earlier, I had sat beside a different window, convinced my life was over. Now I understood that the ending had never been the end. It had been an invitation. An invitation to discover who I was without someone else's judgment. An invitation to build a life that didn't depend on being chosen. An invitation to become the person I had been too afraid to become. If this story touched your heart, please like this video, share it with someone who may be struggling with rejection or self-doubt, leave a comment, and subscribe to Kindness Speaks. Sometimes one story can reach someone at exactly the moment they need hope, and your support helps these stories find the people who need them most. And before we end, I have a special request for you. Comment this sentence below. I am enough, exactly as I am. Write it not for me, but for yourself. Because there may be someone watching this right now who has been told they are not attractive enough, successful enough, young enough, talented enough, or worthy enough. Maybe someone made you feel like you had to earn love, Maybe someone walked away and convinced you that their rejection was proof that something was wrong with you. Please remember this. Someone else's inability to appreciate you is not evidence that you have no value. The woman on that magazine cover didn't become worthy when millions of people saw her. She was worthy when she was sitting alone in that tiny apartment, crying over divorce papers. She was worthy when she doubted herself. She was worthy when she felt broken. She was worthy before the photographs, before the career, before the magazine, before anyone applauded. And so are you. Sometimes life removes a person because you have spent too long looking at yourself through their eyes. Sometimes heartbreak isn't punishment. Sometimes it is the painful beginning of freedom. And sometimes the person who walked away believing they had rejected an ordinary life eventually realizes they had walked away from someone extraordinary. But by then, the extraordinary person has already learned something far more important than how to be admired. She has learned how to love herself. And that is the kind of beauty no magazine